Hey, Kristen.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Yeah. Excited to get these calls back up and running. Feels
Yeah.
like it's been a few weeks. I needed the break though, to be honest. It, I feel a lot more refreshed now. Doing these every week for like the whole year is
Yeah.
it's quite a bit of work for all of us. So I really love how that holiday season comes around and we get to take our couple weeks off there and hopefully come back with some good topics and things for athletes. Yeah, gosh, I don't know where the other coaches are. They are running a bit late, but we'll give them a couple more minutes since we're adjusting back to yeah, to doing this whole thing again. Here we go.
Oh,
Morning,
yeah.
Kylie.
Hi, Kylie.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah, we can get in. The three of us can get into it. I know Sarah and Drew should be here shortly. Um, yeah, kids and stuff, something may have come up. So all good. Yeah, I feel like we talked a lot about season planning um before the break. And there's kind of been like one question left over in here that I think will help athletes because we're all often thinking about like what is that next big thing that we can do? How do we level up on the work that we've done before? And so this question feels very appropriate as we're kind of like starting a new year of training. Um, and the question is, what is an ideal timeline to look at for someone to build up from races that take 2 to 4 hours to races that take all day? Like, for example, 50 miles or 100K or 100 miles. Pretty significant difference, right? Like we're thinking about going from like 2 to 4 hour races. Those are already pretty long to, that next step, which would be, I don't know, 6 hour race or an 8 hour race. What are the signs that you're ready to step it up to a bigger distance? Um, yeah. Kylie, you want to start us off with this one? You had some pretty great notes.
Sure. So typically when I'm working with athletes that are looking at doing longer races, just want to make sure that they kind of understand like the demands of the training, that they feel like they are ready to make that jump, and like looking at, whether that's coming from a place of they feel like they're having some kind of like internal pressure to like move up for some reason, or if they like have really thought this out and they have a pretty valid reason for wanting to move up in distance. And then looking at having that discussion with the athlete and looking at, what is their injury history, and making sure that we think that it's a good idea, like they're in a good spot where they're strong and they have worked through maybe imbalances that they've had in the past. Obviously can't fully predict future injury status, but want to take a good look at that before moving up in distance, making sure that they have the time to recover and sleep and getting good nutrition as well. And not that that's not important for any distance of event that you're doing, but once you start ramping up, trying to get ready for a longer event, you're going to want to be ideally on your feet more, training more. And so some of these things like become even more amplified as far as like how much care you need to be spending, with that nutrition, like, or with that sleep, etc. And then I do like to look at like an athlete's history and their background, how long has this person been running? If you haven't been running very long, then and you haven't raced much before, then we might want to consider doing a shorter distance event first, and see how you handle the training for that before we move you up in distance. I think it can be tough when we hear as coaches that like we get a new athlete and they're like, I want to do 100-miler in 3 months. And that's just not really realistic for a lot of people. And so, taking a look at where they're coming from, and talking the athlete through maybe like how long that process might be to get them to doing something like a 50 or 100-miler. For some athletes, they might be able, if they have an extensive history, they might be able to get there in 3 to 4 to 6 months or something, but even that can be a stretch sometimes. Especially the newer athletes, like I try to encourage like a year or 2 year, like building up to that distance, because it is a pretty big undertaking. So that was kind of long-winded, but I just wanted to go through all my thought processes.
Yeah. And like, just so much good information there for people to consider, right? Like, what's your athletic history? How long have you been running? How long have you been training? What's driving the reasoning behind wanting to jump up to a bigger distance? And then I like to, in the same vein, have athletes think about like, what are the stepping stones we can put in place between where you are now and where you want to go, and what's the timeline for that? I think as coaches, we all see athletes who like rush that timeline, and then there can be a lot of pitfalls when that happens, right? Like the overuse injuries that happen towards the end of a build, like that's a really common one, right? Like good sign, like that maybe we are pushing towards a goal that is a little bit more of a stretch than we're ready for. It's hard to always be able to determine when somebody's ready. And that's like kind of the bulk of this question is like, how do we know when we're ready? Well, I think one is like the mental side. Like you've got to have that fire to be able to spend a whole day racing, a whole day trying to get 50 miles in or 100 miles or a marathon, like whatever it is, you've got to have fire for that. And so it's important to ask, like, what is that goal? What's the why behind that goal? What's the driving force there? And then also thinking about, okay, like, what do I have to do training wise to get there? That to me involves looking at things really practically and having like a very honest discussion with your coach. Like Kylie mentions, like, what is that time frame? Is it 2 years? Is it 6 months? I always want the athlete to take longer, because I've seen a lot of athletes stretch things and then I've seen the negative consequences of that. And so like when I'm like, okay, like, yes, you're rocking it. You're feeling really comfortable on your 4-hour long runs. Your fueling is really solid. We've put in like that effort for like 6 months, and like that base is huge. And so like, it does make sense trying to level up to a race that might take you 8 hours, because like, that's like adding 50% on, like, that's kind of a logical next step, because we can bridge that gap with training. But if we're thinking about like, all right, I'm comfortable with 4-hour long run. I've never done any race or adventure longer than that. I want to do something that's going to take me 24 hours. And it's like, whoa, all right, hold on. What's our time frame for that? Okay, well, I'm thinking like, how long did it take us to get to this place? Oh, it's like, we've been training for a year and it's taken you a year to get comfortable. And now we're looking at like 150% more, more time on feet. And that's a huge consideration. So it's like, okay, maybe that's our big goal for a year from now. And between now and then, like a next logical goal would be getting in a couple of those mid-distance races that like bridge the gap, because we really want to get comfortable. And I think you guys probably see this too. when athletes like they complete like their first ultra or their first trail marathon. And it's a huge deal. Like accomplishing a goal like that is freaking amazing. And it takes a lot of work. But you get to that point, and then the impetus is, and the inclination is to level up instead of, okay, how much can I improve at this particular distance? And how much, base and foundation can I build by getting better at this distance? Yeah. Kristen, what are you thinking there? I know like we kind of coach similar people, and I mean, we all do really. But we have those athletes who are like looking to step it up and to go beyond. Like, what are some of the signs that you're looking for with athletes who, what would you feel like is a great sign if somebody's ready to like step it up to that next distance?
Yeah, I would definitely say looking back at their training log and having a history of consistency.
Oh yeah, nice. I like that.
Really important, because I know that, if you're finding ways to skip long runs or move things around too much, then there might be more of a likelihood to like not put in the work that needs to be like the foundation before you jump up to these bigger races. But definitely like the number one thing I look for, consistency. And then also I think like to your point, TJ, about like the mental aspect, I think that that's huge. Like if you feel mentally ready, and you're kind of like getting like 100-mile curious, I think that that's a good place to be. But when you get to that place, you need to ask yourself, do I have the time to put in this training? Do I have the time to dedicate to like nailing nutrition? Do I have the time to recover? Am I going to be doing strength training? Am I going to be able to prioritize sleep? Like it doesn't have to take over your whole life, but you do have to go in with the understanding that it's time consuming. And, like if your life is going to be really busy around a certain time of the year, like being realistic and honest with yourself about like the demands of training for that event. So those are the two main things I would say.
Totally. And you bring up a really good point about like timing of that key event. So often we'll see athletes like put an event on the schedule, and then they haven't put forth the time to think about like, oh shoot, like that's actually not good timing. That's when my kids are on spring break. Like the peak of my training build is when my kids are on spring break and I actually don't have as much time to train. And it's like, okay, like it's so important to consider those things, especially when stepping up to a new distance, because the training is going to be really, really key in those moments for those athletes. And so if we aren't consistent, like you mentioned, Kristen, or we're having schedule conflicts, it can present a lot of challenges for the athlete, because we don't want to go into new distances, uncertain territory, more or less, without having had some really solid and consistent training that makes us feel confident, because we need to have some of that confidence in order to confront the uncertainty of whether we can do this thing or not, because this stuff is really, really hard. And so it takes more than just mental toughness. You can take the most mentally tough person with the most inconsistent training, and they may not still finish the race. And that's purely because there is a very physical component to all of this. I want to ask you, Kylie, you are such an expert with nutrition. I mean, you're literally the best or one of the best in the country. You've worked with so many athletes who are involved in the transition of like stepping it up in their events, whether they're trying to, I don't know, get faster at a marathon or an OCR event or at a hunt. Like, you're working with people who are constantly trying to level up. Are there signs like on the nutritional side of this that you see, like consistency in fueling, like athletes who are like getting in 300 calories an hour consistently for X number of months tend to like be more ready to go the distance? Like, what are there some nutritional signs that we could be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're I think you're spot on with the, it sounds simple, but like one of the main things that we're looking for is regularity of eating. And so making sure regular intake of food, and then you get into the adequacy piece once you have the regularity piece down. But a lot of people don't even have the regularity piece down. And if you're even struggling to like plan for your week for food, like you don't even do any form of planning, or shopping is just this random process, you've got to be a little bit more organized, because the volume of intake that you need to be able to sustain that level of training is going to be a lot greater. So looking at that kind of stuff, and then during training and racing, I think if you at least have a base fueling plan, even if it's not perfect, like 300 calories an hour, I don't think someone necessarily needs to be there yet, but you need to have a fueling plan and be like regularly taking in your nutrition during your long runs. And if you're not, and you're sitting out there and you're like, oh crap, I'm training for a 50 or 100 and I don't do that, that's something that you definitely want to address, like sooner rather than later. Because I will get started with people that are like, oh yeah, like, no, I haven't really thought about that yet, though I do want to work on the daily nutrition stuff first, though. And I think like it gets overlooked, like fueling during longer training sessions, it also impacts your injury status. So if you don't have that dialed in, that's gonna be not a great thing later down the road. And then even if we work with people on nutrition, but also habits around sleep and fueling pre and post workout, like just different habits throughout your day. And so like ensuring that you are able to have a pretty good sleep routine. Like if you're consistently getting 4 hours of sleep every night and you haven't addressed that, that's something that also I kind of am like, you really should be addressing this, because sleep is a really important part of this process, especially if you don't want to get injured.
Yeah, Kristen, did you want to jump in there?
No, I'm just over here like, yes. Everything she says is right.
Yeah,
Real quick,
go ahead,
may
Drew,
I-
please.
So what I'm thinking is, so all of us know, like running, we have to obviously practice more than just running. Just like Kylie said, you're practicing your nutrition, you're practicing your sleeping, you're practicing your stretching and your strengthening, and just so much out there. If you don't have like a specific, say, just in this example, like a 50-mile event that you're like really dying to run, this one specific one where you have like a hard date when that race is going to happen. If you're more interested in just accomplishing the distance, where you're open to maybe different kinds of events throughout the year, you just know that 50 miles is the next stepping stone towards your goal or whatever, consider not picking a race until like there are other signs, like until you get that framework set up where you are sleeping better and you are eating better and have that nutrition plan, and things are starting to work for you, so that you don't feel the pressure or anxiety of having to do all this stuff, because it is a lot, having to do all this stuff in like a very, say it was just like 6 months or whatever it turned out to be. Like, don't set that boundary for yourself. Like, leave it open-ended, like get all the other stuff done first and start working towards that goal with your coach until you're like, okay, like I'm feeling good about this. I'm feeling confident about this. I'm showing the signs that this is gonna happen. Now talk to the coach and see, like, my window of getting this 50-mile race in is starting to take shape. It's starting to take form. And then get up and look for maybe some 50-mile races in that window, if all of that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense. And something that I really want to reiterate is like, never race an ultra, never choose to do an ultra. Or, I mean, and this can exist for runners who are doing shorter distance races too, but think about it. If you are comfortable with the 10K, you haven't done a marathon yet. Never choose a marathon, never choose a 50, never choose 100 if you aren't all in on it. It can't just be one of those things. It's like, oh, it's the next logical step. You have to have more behind that because you're going to be spending a lot of time out there grinding. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to like go through like the ringer of experiences, and you've got to be mentally prepared for that. It can't be just about the distance or that next logical step. Like I think, Drew does a great job of presenting that important side of this. If you're purely racing and your pure motivation is just to get that distance down, wait until you find a race that really speaks to you. And then there are some like ways you can work with your coach on that. It's like, okay, well, a 50 miler is great, but like maybe I don't necessarily want to do a mountainous 50 miler because that's going to cause all this hiking and it's going to be a significantly longer event. And so like maybe my endurance and my fitness isn't there yet. So it's better to do a faster, flatter 50 miler. And like, there's also ways to tweak and look at those goals based on where you're at. I particularly, like for me, with the athletes that I'm coaching, I would consider like a faster 50 as a great stepping stone for getting ready for a longer, more mountainous 50, because it's like this intermediary where you can get used to the distance, but you don't have the full commitment of like, that's a 10-hour 50 for where you're at right now in the process. And that is like a 6.5-hour 50 for where you're at in the like terrain can make a huge difference in these things. So it's also something to consider. But more importantly, and like what we're really getting to the heart of right here is like, what are your habits? What does your lifestyle look like? Are those things in place now? If they're not, we need to work on building those habits. So you've got that strong foundation, like Drew and Kylie and Kristen mentioned, you have that strong foundation to then apply the work toward, to and on top of, so you can actually get out there and do these things while avoiding injury, while avoiding burnout. Something that I think is really related to this is the idea of the mental side of all of this. Like we all have a certain amount of mental and emotional bandwidth. I like to look at it as like a stress bucket, and like you add to the stress, but all the things in life add or subtract from the stress bucket. And so you're either filling that up with life stuff, training, family stuff, financial stresses, whatever, all this stuff can fill the bucket, or it can, help to re-energize you and take out of the bucket. If your bucket is really full, adding a very difficult goal to your schedule is probably not ideal, right? So like we all have to take time to look at these things pragmatically, to consider the circumstances and the parameters around our lives and ask, is it appropriate to go for a goal with the bandwidth that we currently have? It's not about thinking about some idealized version of ourselves and our bandwidth. Like that's not great, because that's not a realistic way of looking at where you are now. And both, Drew, Kristen, and Kylie, they all mentioned like, what are your habits? And so like those habits have a lot to do with where you're at with that bandwidth. Like, are you good at setting boundaries? Like, are you in control of your, your home life? Like, do you feel like things are, potentially stressful with work? And like, are you having trouble getting your runs in? Like, where are those stresses? How are they contributing to your current ability to train? Not an idealized version of where you want to be, but like an actual look at where you are now, because your current life state is most likely the life state you're gonna be in when you're training for that goal, not some idealized version of yourself. And that key insight, I think, is really, really important for athletes, because when we see athletes who hoping for the best, which is great, I want everyone to improve on this stuff, but when we're hoping for the best, we don't have a realistic picture of where we are now. It becomes really difficult to put the steps in place along the way to get ready for the ultra, to get ready for the marathon, 10K, whatever it is, right? And so like we need to start smaller. We need to think about shorter races, more consistent training, building out those daily habits, like eating really well, sleeping well, like making sure that those things are locked in first. And then as we progress, we can start to get ready for the bigger races. Does that like bring up anything for you coaches? Just that slight shift to kind of like that current stress state.
Yes. I think for some athletes that I've coached, a lot of times they when they're sort of like reevaluating where they are, like I know we've talked a lot about like the setbacks in the training process and being okay with saying like, this is where I'm at right now. It's not forever. Like that's great too. That's totally fine. But I think that for everyone, the goal is to progress, right? And like progress is purpose, and that's what consistency is for. But then I think you get to a point where you try to figure out what the balance is with real life and training. And for me, I've had to, I think for all the coaches, we've had to have conversations with athletes just to like remind them what their goals are, and then reinforce the conversations that have happened previously to get to this point. So, you know, for some athletes, it's like when my life gets really busy, running's the first thing to go on the back burner. And I think as coaches, it's really important to be like, hey, you know, 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, this is the conversation we had. And you said like, you want to run 100-mile. Is that still your goal? Does that still resonate with you? And if so, then I think the habits leading up to this and the habits in your day-to-day life are really important to look back on and reevaluate. And the thing that gets me like when I get really busy too, like, yeah, I totally understand it's hard to get out the door. But there is a quote from James Clear in his book, Atomic Habits, that says, we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our habits. And so making sure that your habits are in line with your goals and with where you want to be is so important. So I think that having the foundation to step up in distance and having the discipline to step up in distance almost go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Kylie or Drew, last word on this subject before we move on?
No, I think we crushed it.
All right, awesome. You guys are rocking it. All right. Well, it's winter, it's icy. We got to talk a little bit about cross training. I know not every athlete on our team, not every athlete who's listening to this call has consistent access to your treadmill, which is definitely one of our recommended things, especially for athletes who live in wintry places or places with the potential for poor air quality in the summer months due to fire and stuff. Having that treadmill access is great, but not everybody has treadmill access. And so for days when the weather is bad, I can't run outside and it's not possible to get to a treadmill, what's the best like ratio? What are you guys doing to help athletes substitute a run for cross training, like biking or elliptical? I feel like those are the two that I use the most. Drew, why don't you start us out on this? You had some pretty good hard numbers that I definitely think will help athletes out with.
Yeah. So the idea is that if you're cross training for whatever reason, that it's not like a long-term solution, right? It may be 1 day, maybe 3 days, maybe a week, whatever it turns out. But in the grand scheme of things, it's over a fairly short period of time during your training block. So the idea is that I'm with my athletes, I'm not trying to write like workouts that would take the place of like a speed workout or a hill workout. The idea is that those cross training days are just what we'll call it maintenance days, so to speak. So you're maintaining fitness, you're maintaining routine and whatnot. I really love for my athletes to be able to jump, well, when we don't have a treadmill, right? Look at maybe jumping on a stationary bike indoors. Elliptical would be the same. And the idea is if we have mileage or distance, we'll say in the log, I usually will convert that over to time, because obviously like the distance measurements and all types of different machinery is all a little different. So we switch to time. We continue with effort. That's something we were doing anyway. And then trying to increase, like if we're running for 60 minutes, on a day, or what would have been equivalent to 60 minutes. If we're going to switch to the bike, I up it just a little bit, knowing that it's just a maintenance deal, about 120%. So boosting up closer to 80 minutes if possible, for that specific scenario. But also at the same time, trying to tell the athlete, like, just because you're not running this day, like, it's fine. Like, you're not missing a day. Like, you're fine. Like, you're still getting those, adaptations of getting the workout in. And really most important is staying with that routine, but trying to frame it that way.
Yeah, 100%. And I love the overarching principle of using the bike to kind of just stay in that training routine, to still connect with like the athletic part of your identity. It may not be like perfect running training, but it's actually a great way to engage the aerobic system, stay involved in the process, all of that. And I think like Kylie, Kristen, like Drew, you guys are just so right on with those notes. Personally, like, I feel like there's no like hard ratio. It's more like, it's like 1 to 3 or like 100 to 120%. Like, there's a little bit of a difference there, but it also very individualized, right? Like if you've got an athlete who's like really fit, but doesn't have as much like running experience, I can like maybe give them a little bit more on the bike. Maybe we're actually already using the bike a little bit more often for cross training, especially if it's an athlete who's like making a transition back to running after injury or something like that. And then like the other thing to consider is like, what if we're using the bike because we are injured, and not necessarily because like of bad weather, but we're using some cross training because the weather, not because the weather's bad, but because we're working through an injury. And in those situations, I usually give the athlete a lot less, because I want the athlete to have a lot less training stress, because usually injuries happen because we have an abundance of stress that the body's not adapting to. So if we just replace one stress with another stress, it's going to be very hard to recover and get better. So we want to limit that and do probably what is just enough for maintenance, to continue to keep the aerobic system active, but not to like overdo it, because we need to reduce stress when we are injured. Kylie or Kristen, I feel like this is a pretty standard question, but like, either of you guys want the last word on this? Cool. All right. Let's move on with like another bigger topic here. Balancing life with training. I feel like this is something that we kind of consistently talk about, like in all of these questions. But I feel like it's good to hit on at the beginning of the year. And so that's why we're bringing it up now. Just these broader topics of, is there balance? How can we find balance in our training when life gets busy? And are there any tips that, the coaches might have, or we're all training too. We're all involved in these processes and have been for a long time. So, through our experience and reading the latest research on habits and all of that, I feel we have a lot to offer athletes in this department. And it's great to get an idea on these things, like at the beginning of the year, as we're starting to really work towards our big goals over the next several months. Kristen, you mentioned something really important. Let's start off with this idea of thinking about first, like, what are your goals, and reinforcing those goals when life gets busy.
Yeah, I think sometimes I do have to have those like hard conversations where I'm like, this has been in the log for months. This is the training blocks that I've helped build out for this specific goal, and just kind of, it's a fine line between like encouraging the stoke and then also like encouraging the discipline to match the stoke to get to these goals. And like, again, like reinforcing the conversations we've had previously and reminding the athletes, like, this is your goal and you can do it. And we've set you up for success here. So I think that that's really important, because when things get busy, I think that there's a lot of ways that you can say, oh, I couldn't get to my run today. Oh, I couldn't do strength today. Oh, I haven't foam rolled in a month. And as a coach, you're just like, oh my God, what? You know, like we have to prioritize these things because this is your goal, and like your goals matter, and like this is important. So let's make it happen.
Right. Like those goals do really matter, right? Like even when life is busy, even when we're trying to find the balance and are struggling in it, like a lot of athletes really take the time to consider their goals and their running seasons. And like when we think about it all, we often like back to this thing about like having like an idolized view of where we're going to be when we're building towards these goals and we're like really in the throes of those big weeks and putting in the time. I feel like I'm like, this really applies to me and to other people that I know. It's like, oh yeah, we're really hoping for the best. Like work won't be stressful when I'm working, doing those long runs. Like life won't be stressful when I'm doing those long runs. Like it's all going to go well. And I'm going to have the time to get the foam roller out. And I'm going to have the time to, stretch after my runs. And I'm not going to feel like, pressed when I have to do a 4-hour long run. Like I'm going to like really enjoy it. And like, we all have that, like that hopefulness. But the reality is like, we often like plan as if we're going to have these best case scenarios play out. And then when we get there, we're like, oh crap, like this is really hard. I'm struggling to, do all the small things that like kind of act as the glue that keeps everything together in those big moments, those big training moments. It's really normal actually. And I think like normalizing that is important. I have a lot of athletes who are like big planners and they want to know when they're doing such and such a long run 6 months from now. And I'm like, almost like cautiously like, okay, like we're planning for this, but 6 months from now, like so much can happen. So if we're too caught up in those details, it's very, very hard to have the flexibility to work through that in a way that's meaningful for the training, that keeps you on track and working towards those goals, but also takes into account like almost this thing that like, I feel like we've kind of gotten to this place as coaches where we're like striving for balance is a great thing, but we need to realize that that is a very, very imperfect process. And it's unlikely that any of us will ever succeed in having complete balance, right? Like, I feel like it's worthy to pursue that and be aware of the things that affect us and throw our balance off and ask us to pivot. But to find like a perfect way to make that all work together is really hard. I just want to throw it to Kylie. I see you nodding over there. Like you working with tons of people, both in running and nutrition, who are going for big goals, but then, like I'm sure you have experience with people just struggling to put it together when like the situation actually becomes much more muddied. Like, wow, I'm really busy. It's hard to get this done. Like what kind of advice do you have in those moments?
Yeah, usually what I try to do is, break down. Well, number one, I always have people outline before I get started with them on my nutrition stuff, like they're like a letter to themselves as to like why they want to engage in this process and why they want to achieve this goal. So remembering your why, we talk about that a lot here too. And then you can come back to that when things are getting like challenging, etc. But also then breaking down, if there's a challenging situation, breaking that down into like steps and trying to figure out, okay, how sometimes if there's a bunch of things going on, people get overwhelmed with, I don't know what to tackle first, or like, I don't know how to make this a priority. So like breaking it down for them into different steps or like goal-oriented things that they could try to achieve one by one versus like getting overwhelmed by the whole process. And I know someone had said, one of the coaches ahead of time had said like blocking out time or like maybe putting an alarm on things like as a reminder, even just those little types of things can be helpful when you're trying to remember like what your priorities are. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have an alarm or a time blocked out that you're actually going to fully follow through with that thing that you're trying to do. But at the same time, if you get going in your day and you tend to forget about eating or drinking or doing your training session, etc., then it can be like that switch, like, oh yeah, I remember I wanted to make this a priority. The other thing is just like setting yourself up for success, because, you know, like with running or something, we can have our clothes ready, our shoes ready in the morning, or like have those things kind of ready and visible, and just getting out there and getting started can be helpful. Same thing with like nutrition, like just doing like 10 minutes of planning for, you know, your next week. Like even that amount of planning can help you get some things organized so that it's not this scattered process and, you know, you're just all over the place and more likely to not kind of get on track with the things that you want to be on track with. And I usually say to athletes, like, I want to teach people how to be adaptable athletes in different situations. So what like things are always going to come up, so you need to figure out like, what is my strategy going to be in this situation, and I need to be able to adapt, because life is not, you don't just exist in this vacuum and everything's going to be the same every day. So we have to be able to know and be confident in what we're doing on different days. Like if a work meeting comes up and you're supposed to have a run, like what are you going to do on that type of day? You know, just thinking about that kind of stuff, I think is good. And that's also something that coaches can help with as well.
I love that last kind of part of what you're talking about there, Kylie, with like, what are these scenarios that might arise, and, you know, are we going to do in those situations? Especially like, I like athletes to have a combination of both, like being able to reach out to me, but also wanting to work through these things independently too. I feel like sometimes with the way that we've structured our coaching, we're a little handholdy. And so athletes get too used to asking us for help with everything. And like, the fact of the matter is, like, when it comes down to doing the race, I'm not going to be there. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. And so like, if you ask me for advice on everything, you're going to really struggle with the parts of the process that require independence. And there are many parts of this process where independence is inherent in this. And so what are those scenarios? And I think working through those a little bit on your own as the athlete can be really beneficial, because things are always going to come up, right? Like Coach Zoe always talks about this. She's like, life never gets easier. Life never gets less stressful, especially if you're the kind of person, and so many people, you know, on our team we're all pursuing things at a high level. We're like showing up for our families at a high level. Like we're career oriented. We're going for these big goals. And like that kind of life, just inherent in that process are challenges and stressful situations. That's what it's all about. And like, we're in part training to be prepared for those things. And so in those situations, like, what do we default to? And I'm really curious and want to like pick this apart a little bit. Like, let me turn it over to you, Drew, because like, I feel like you know this better than anybody. Like, you've got 2 kids, like you're really busy, like you're coaching full time. You're responsible for a lot of athletes. You're responsible for your own training too, and for like a lot of the family stuff and household stuff in your family. Like, when things are like crazy, how do you prioritize, more or less? Like, if that meeting comes up, do you shorten your run, or do you try to fit it in some, like, what is, you kind of get what I'm getting at here.
It's funny that you list off my schedule, because Alicia and I were talking this morning about how the kids are winning. We are getting our asses handed to us right now. It's hard. And so what I find when things pop up and you're trying to prioritize, because you do have all these responsibilities and things that in the end, let's be real, a lot that is more important than running, especially like family and whatnot. But I'm the kind of person, I get overwhelmed. I have to write things down. Like I literally have to I get it out of my head. I get it on paper. I have to write down all the things that I'm supposed to do. And maybe even just a day, like this is what I have to do today. And then seeing it on paper, for me, it's just a way for me to understand, like, okay, I need to run today. That's going to take an hour. Done. Like I'll cross it off my list. I need to brush my teeth. I need to take a shower. I need to pack the kids' lunches. Like I need to do like these 2 loads of laundry. Like I have to go in and I have to like get all my logs done. Like, and this is the time that I budget for it. And I know that sounds like tedious. I know it sounds overwhelming, but on days when I'm overwhelmed, it helps to just have it all written down, right? Over time, when you've, I guess we talk about like balance, right? And creating like routine, like once after, I mean, a little while, it changes week to week, let's be real, but you get everything kind of sorted. And it seems like over time, it becomes like that practice becomes habit. And it gets a little easier as you go on. But it's really easy for something new to pop into your life and then for that to disrupt your flow and to disrupt your priorities and your balance, so to speak. And then you pretty much start over again. Be like, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I gotta get it all down and then like make that habit again. But it's hard. Like, I don't want anyone to think it's easy. Like we can all talk about it and the why and the this and the that, but it's hard. And it's okay to admit that it's hard. And it's okay for there to be days where you're like, man, I forgot to put a jacket on my child today and it's 30 degrees outside. You know, shit happens, right? But just doing your best is important. Keeping your positive attitude is important. And then just, you know, figuring it out as you go.
Yeah, I love the writing things down. I feel like when I start to write things down, and I'm not a Google Calendar person, I keep a planner and I write it in because it sort of is like muscle memory for me. I make that connection and then I kind of have these things in my mind as I go throughout my day. And then I will start to cross things off on the list, and that kind of feels nice mentally. I'm curious from like a real nuts and bolts training perspective, what you guys think. We talked about the glue, the small things that kind of like hold the process together. The strength work, the stretching, the foam rolling, like eating well and making sure that when we're busy, things like 3 balanced meals don't go out the window. And like these things that like I feel like are like the glue that keep us running consistently. I'm curious what you guys think. Like, should we be prioritizing those things at the detriment of like getting the full length of our run done on a busy day? Or is it okay to reduce the amount of running we do to make sure that we can still have time for those small things? Kristen, Kylie, Drew.
If it's okay, girls, let me jump in real quick because my answer's short. Yes, it is definitely okay to shorten a run if you've got a lot on your plate. The last thing we want as coaches is for you to feel overwhelmed because of your run schedule. And we preach all the time, you all are human beings before you're runners. You're so many things before you're a runner. And so if you are going to prioritize running over things that truly are more important to you, whether it be maybe your career or a presentation one day or your family or whatever else, we might have to have a deeper conversation about your priorities and where running fits into your life. It doesn't mean that you can't run, right? We can all run, but if there's a day where you have like 6 to 8 miles on your schedule and you're like, man, it goes back to like, man, I don't feel good because I didn't run the full 8, the maximum level of my range. Like, just, it's okay. Like, run lower. If you only have time for 4, honestly, I'd be like, I get it. Like, stress is stress. You've got a stressful day. I'm actually happy that you prioritize some other things and reduced your volume that day to get it done. But yes, the answer is yes.
Nice. This is one of those like stop, rewind, listen again moments that I hope we have like in every call, because that was so good. Like we need to hold things loosely. Like you guys are so much more than just runners. A lot of things are prioritized ahead of the athletic self or that part of our identity. And something that I often look at in my training logs is like when athlete feedback is like life is busy, overwhelming, stressful, and the athlete, or I'm not feeling good, and the athlete consistently does the high end of their mileage or their time volume range, I flag that as a red flag. Why aren't you doing less? Because as soon as you take a little bit off your plate, and one of the things that's easy to adjust in a busy life is your training. Like some of you may think that's unfortunate, but as coaches, we actually think that's a fortunate thing, because your best training isn't the most you can do. It's what you can do when you consider all of those other things happening in your life. And so like and I feel like it's also more than okay to shorten the run even beyond what the range is, because on a certain given day, 30 minutes may be all that you can give, while also making sure that you eat 3, healthy meals, while making sure that you spend a little time working on your calves, which like always get tight when you're stressed out and you're running a lot. Like all of these little things that like help get us to where we want to go. And when we're in those big moments, when we're really working towards our goal, and it's like that big peak weekend, and like something comes in and throws a wrench in our schedule, it's so important not to be married to like that exact like training, that exact number on the schedule, that exact like I needed 4 hours, like 3 hours is fine, or 2 hours, or 90 minutes. Like in this, we can reverse this and go all the way back to the first thing we talked about in this call when we think about those goals. If we're pursuing our goals from a place of consistency, strong foundation over many months and ideally years, we can really hold it loosely when things get busy, because we know we have that history to draw from. And one missed workout or having to shorten a bunch of runs in a week because life is busy, that's never going to determine the outcome of an event for an athlete who is consistent. It never will. And so we can really relax our grip on that.
Can I?
Yeah, Kylie,
I just
please.
want to be on the opposite side of things, though. Like I do sometimes have athletes that are always shortening things. And I think like then it's time to have that conversation with your coach. Like what, what should my goals be right now? Because, and being okay with that. Like maybe the 100-miler that you thought was going to be a good option right now is not the best option for me. Because if you can't get in a certain amount of training, then I do think we have to be smart and like be okay with, okay, like maybe I am only ready for this right now. And I've just seen that with sometimes with athletes, and it's like a thing where it's like maybe hard to accept that like now isn't the best time. But I think being okay with that and being like, all right, like there's a lot going on in my life right now. Like I need to maybe just take a step back, and I can still do this someday, but at this time, maybe it's not the best thing for me. So I just want to throw that out there, because it's like something that I actually have seen as well on the other end of the spectrum. And I think it's important to like acknowledge that that's okay. But at the same time, like we do need to get in a certain level of training, maybe for doing this like 100-mile distance, to be ready for that.
100%. And I think it's great that you brought up that like other perspective, and it's really so much related to what I was just saying. It's like, well, if we're really consistent all the time, having some days where we don't hit, our mileage goal, or, we're not able to get all the training stress in that we need, that's okay. But if that is a regular thing, we're not really in a gray area there. Like a difficult discussion between the coach and the athlete has to happen there, where we do need to discuss whether or not you're going to actually be ready to run, a healthy race, because the point is not to finish at all costs. The point is to finish and to feel good and to be able to walk away from that race, being able to run, some days or hopefully weeks after. And so sometimes what we see is athletes who like don't put the work in, but feel they're very mentally strong. And so they're like going through the throes of life. They are really busy, but they don't adjust the goal. They often complete the race, but then, they get injured as a result, or they really are burned out because it was too much. And so they're not going to run consistently anymore after the race. And so like it's really tough. I feel like I struggle as a coach to have those hard conversations sometimes because people really love their goals and we want to support them. But the truth of it all is like there is a readiness factor, right? Like that we all have to have when we're going for it. Because we want to do these things in a healthy way, not in like a one and done kind of thing. Yeah, I'm curious, Kylie, like just in the last minute or two, because you kind of got us on the subject. Where do you see it necessary to like give athletes that push rather than like, okay, we've been giving you a lot of grace. I always try to come in with the assumption in athletes like doing the very best they can. But when that thing is like, when they're falling short of like the minimum they need to do to get ready for the race, like that push, it's like, okay, we either need to step this up now, even though things are busy and you need to figure out how to make it happen, or we need to change the goal. Like, what do those conversations look like with you and your athletes?
I try to give gentle reminders a couple of times, and then I don't know if I have like a particular cut. I mean, I would say I probably have cutoffs for certain distance races, like cutoffs for like how far out we need to be doing certain things. And that I think is going to vary depending on the race distance that you're doing and what their goals are. But then I usually will be at a certain point, I will be direct with the person and say, hey, like, I think we need to have a conversation about your upcoming like race goals. And try to be really understanding with the person. Like, I know a lot's been going on. Maybe we need to maybe adjust our goals, like thoughts on that, and then maybe having like a quick like email or conversation or something on that to maybe adjust those goals. I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast, like every time 4 to 6 weeks beforehand, but I think it depends on like the situation and but as coaches, like I think it's always tough to have those conversations and knowing when to kind of like be a little bit firmer with people and also like be pretty, empathetic, like as to the situation of the athlete.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the art of coaching, right? Like knowing when those moments are, knowing when that's useful and knowing when like, you need to have more grace and how to approach each individual athlete based on their communication style and their personalities. It's complicated and it's very detail oriented, which is one of the hard things, but fun things about being a coach. And, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't, but that's it's an imperfect process, which is kind of like what makes it so related to everything that we've talked about, especially around balance and things like that. Like it's really hard. Like we all have training blocks that go really well, and we all have training blocks that don't go as well as we've hoped. And sometimes we race and sometimes we step back from those goals. And it's a real mixed bag. Like if you look at I'm sure like the four of us, if we like looked at our entire athletic careers, like there'd be a mix of all of that. And I think that's kind of like a great opportunity for learning and for self-improvement and things like that. And that really, in the end, like is the whole point. It's not just like about the goals, it's about like the pursuit and the journey and how that makes us feel and where that takes us and how that allows us to grow and stuff like that. Like, yeah, the goals are important. Yes, like we want to be competitive and race and like go for PRs and all of that. But there are things that I feel, and I know all of us as coaches share the same perspective, that there are things, the overarching ideas that I feel and we feel are more important. And I think it's like really great to just keep that in mind, both as coaches and as athletes, like when we're approaching these difficult and delicate situations that just involve a lot of nuance. Like the work life and training balance is one of those things that involves a lot of nuance. And so like there's no like hard and fast rules, but something that like we've really gained from discussing this is like we don't want to let the glue kind of like go away. Like we want to stick with our habits, right? Like, and make time for them, even if it means running a little bit less. Because then when we get out of those stressful situations, we still have the habits that allow us to level up and go for it. And like, if your coach is paying attention, they'll make the adjustments, and then you'll be able to ease back into things. And like that life stuff is often like a great opportunity for a down week. It's perfect. And then like the next week we can level up when you're feeling better. And you know, we can play off those cycles like all year round, and really good coaching generally does that. And so I think it's important, like for athletes who are going through it a little bit, to try to zoom out and remember that, like, we've got your back. We're going to make sure that, you know, you get the work in. We're going to make sure that the plan and the specifics are there so you can be successful, and we're going to help hold you accountable to all of that. Yeah, anybody with the last word? Cool. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate hearing from you all and you being back with us. Next week, we are going to talk about the never enough mentality. And we might get into some other stuff, TBA. Hope to see you all there. Have a good weekend.